In this video, I'm going to talk about 6 characteristics of the modern self, according to social psychologist Dan McAdams. Hi everybody, I'm Bruce Lambert from How Communication Works. This is a channel where I teach you about communication skills so you can improve your relationships, succeed at work, and be more confident. As someone who studies communication in the social world, the concept of the self and identity are centrally significant concepts for me. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you know that I'm deeply influenced by 20th century sociologist Erving Goffman. Although sociologists still write and think about the self and identity, a lot of that work is now being done by social psychologists. And among modern social psychologists, the one who's influenced me most and whose work I like the best is Dan McAdams of Northwestern University. What I'm going to talk about today is the 6 characteristics of the modern self that Dan McAdams wrote about in his recent article entitled Personality, Modernity, and the Storied Self. One of the points that McAdams tries to make in this article is that, of course, the self is an ancient concept, as is the identity. But if you want to understand what it's like to be a modern self and have a modern identity, you need to understand what modernity is and even post-modernity and how those things impact on our sense of ourselves in modern times, especially in the West. McAdams argues you can't understand the self apart from its historical context. And the historical context that's most relevant for understanding contemporary selves is modernity. So what is modernity? Modernity is the set of social and political and economic systems that began to develop in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially after the Industrial Revolution, characterized by capitalism, markets, democracies, nation states, and the dominance of science and technology. So what you would recognize as a modern Western industrial or post-industrial society is a modern society by this definition. And of course, by this time in the 21st century, there are many non-Western countries that are modern by this definition as well. Modernity is also characterized by a generalized skepticism towards religion and other traditional sources of authority, and a preference for science, reason, rationality, evidence, objectivity, positivism, and the belief that progress will be promoted by commitment to these kinds of rational and scientific ideals. One thing that you see with the birth of modernity is that people start writing in around 1800 about the difficulty of maintaining a modern sense of self. 2 of the challenges that modern people face in maintaining a modern sense of self are, first of all, maintaining a sort of continuity of self from one moment to the next, from one day to the next, from one year to the next, and maintaining a continuity of self across all the different contexts, roles, and situations that you might find yourself in. This becomes increasingly challenging in the diverse set of circumstances and roles that we encounter as modern people. Another challenge of the modern self is a sort of uniqueness and differentiation. We want to define and maintain a sense of self which is unique from other people, but is also connected and related to other people. And so all of us who have tried to maintain a modern sense of self can start to relate to how difficult these challenges really are. The main thing I want to do in this video is describe Dan McAdams' 6 characteristics of the modern self. The first characteristic is that the self is a reflexive project that the individual works on. In pre-modern cultures, our selves and our identities were often given to us or forced upon us by our social position with little hope of uniqueness or originality or social mobility. But in the modern world, it's very different. We're expected to create our own selves and identities. So the ongoing creation of a self is a project we're all, or all modern people, are engaged in for their entire lifetimes. It's a reflexive project in that the self is both the one doing the creating and the thing being created. William James, the 19th century psychologist and philosopher and the founder of American psychology, talked about the I and the me. So in that sort of vocabulary, the I is creating the me. The second characteristic of the modern self is that it is created in the context of ordinary, everyday life. In the pre-modern world, some larger system of authority, the king, the tribe, the church, would have defined ourselves for us and given us a moral framework for thinking about ourselves. But the modern self is constructed in the context of ordinary life, especially in the context of work and family. The third characteristic of the modern self is that it is multi-layered and deeply structured. Hence, modern people are concerned with finding themselves and exploring the depth of their inner lives. And because in modernity you have the absence of the church or some other grand moral authority, it becomes more and more important to both identify the core true self, which is thought to be the new root of moral authority, and then to be true to the core self. So it's in this context that modern people start to be extremely concerned with authenticity and their true self. The fourth characteristic of the modern self is that it is seen in developmental terms. It grows and changes over time. One of the defining characteristics of human lives in modernity is the extension of the lifespan, which was about 40 or 50 years old at the beginning of the 20th century, was about 75 years old at the end of the 20th century. So modern people expect to lead long lives, and so they see their lives as long-term trajectories characterized by growth and development and maturation and change, and hence you get modern concepts of self-development like self-actualization and self-improvement, and eventually even self-transcendence. The fifth characteristic of the modern self is related to the fourth. So in the fourth characteristic, I said that the self develops over the entire long lifespan. The fifth characteristic of the self is that the self seeks temporal coherence. That means coherence over time. One of the challenges of being a modern self is to be able to fashion a narrative of the self, which provides a sense of continuity and wholeness across the entire lifespan so that we can stitch together a story that connects our childhood to our adolescence, to our young adulthood, to our middle age, to our old age in a way that there's continuity and coherence. This fifth characteristic is of special interest to Dan McAdams because it is the self-narrative or the stories of our lives that gives our lives this sense of coherence and continuity over time. And McAdams is best known for developing what's called the narrative study of lives, which is the sense in which people construct self-narratives or autobiographical stories of themselves as a way of constructing their personalities and identities over time. In the modern context, then, having a stable identity is really a matter of being able to keep a certain kind of narrative going. And the sixth and final characteristic of modern selves is that two different modern selves, two separate people, connect to one another in the context of what McAdams calls the pure relationship. This idea of the pure relationship becomes the ideal of connectedness and love and intimacy in the modern context. And the pure relationship is what most of us would recognize as modern love, which isn't arranged by our parents or dictated by the church or some other authority, but is instead based on personal connection for the purpose of personal fulfillment of our own deepest needs. This pure relationship is also thought to be the main context for honest, open connection and intimacy. It's flexible and negotiable, and it's always focused on achieving the mutual self-actualization of both partners in this pure relationship. Of course, this is a fiction, and most of us who have been in modern romantic relationships realize that it's essentially impossible to achieve this kind of pure relationship, but nevertheless, it is an ideal of the modern self. There's much more to be said about the modern self than I've said here. All I've done is describe here the 6 characteristics of the modern self according to Dan McAdams. But even the paper that I've drawn this from, which I'll link to in the description, talks a lot more, especially about the narratives of the self. And I'll make a separate video about these self and identity defining narratives. But for now, I just wanted to talk about these 6 characteristics of the modern self. Eventually, I want to make more videos about the notion of authenticity and being true to our true selves, but I thought we needed this as background before we could talk about those other topics. If you enjoy this type of video about communication and social science, please like the video and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.